Good morning, I'm Claire Murphy. Welcome to the Solo Bureau. The last time Australia recorded any meaningful fall in house prices, it was 2008, during the global financial crisis. Now, in 2026, they're falling again for a range of reasons. But just how far can they drop before we get into real economic trouble? After all, for many Aussies, homes have become the one big investment you can count on increasing in value over time. We'll speak to an economist to find out just how much dip we can do. Actually, before I get into today's top stories, I want to address something that happened yesterday. And I do need to give you the heads up, we are about to get a little bit gross. So if you are eating breakfast, I sincerely apologise. So instead of writing the "while you were sleeping" Substack yesterday, I accidentally wrote "while you were seeping." Now, this was pointed out to me by a few of you, but Claire Kingston and I started chatting on Instagram, and I mentioned that it sounded like maybe a new way of talking about having your period, and she suggested the new title, "Not Snoozing, Oozing," which I understand might be a lot to discuss this early in the morning, but it was hilarious. And so that is now the show's unofficial motto. Not snoozing, oozing. Thank you, Claire. Alrighty, let's get into it. Here's what's been happening while you were sleeping, not seeping. It is Tuesday, July 21. A man has been arrested after allegedly attempting to set fire to FBI headquarters in New York. An incendiary device was set off at a building that houses FBI headquarters and an Immigration and Customs Enforcement office in Lower Manhattan. Video footage shows uniformed police and other officers surrounding a man and taking him into custody as smoke fills the area. FBI Director Kash Patel posted a statement on X saying that 2 minor injuries were reported and that the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force is now investigating. An Australian woman accused of travelling to Islamic State-controlled Syria and joining the terror group has been granted bail. Rayan El-Houli will be released into the community after her risk of reoffending was considered relatively low. The mother of 4 was charged back in May with travelling to a declared conflict zone and joining ISIS. The 34-year-old's bid for bail was successful, Melbourne Magistrate Brett Sonnett accepting a combination of factors, including her role as primary caregiver to her children and her health as she battles PTSD and potentially a multiple sclerosis diagnosis. He also pointed out that she had lived in the community for 8 months prior to her arrest without any issue. Her bail conditions include reporting to police 5 times a week, surrendering her passport, and participating in a de-radicalisation program. She's also barred from going within 100 metres of any place of worship, with the exception of her own mosque, and must not access any social media or email except from one monitored phone. UK rapper Young Philly has pleaded not guilty to 6 counts of sexually penetrating a 20-year-old woman without consent in a Perth hotel room back in September 2024. The 30-year-old also denies impeding the woman's breathing after she accused him of biting, slapping and choking her during the alleged attack. The court heard how the woman was a fan of Young Philly and had gone to the gig at a bar in Perth's northern suburbs wearing her favourite lucky white top. After spending time with him and his entourage in a VIP area, she agreed to go back to his hotel where she says she believed there would be an after party. Instead, after being told to hand over her phone, she claims they went back to his hotel room alone, where she allegedly suffered multiple injuries during the assault, including extensive bruising to her face and neck and a bite wound to her right breast that required a tetanus shot. The prosecutor said her shirt turned out to be anything but lucky. The trial is continuing. A Russian missile strike has targeted a ship carrying corn near the Ukraine's southern port of Odessa. According to Ukrainian officials, the strike killed 10 people in the deadliest attack in a weeks-long flare-up of violence in the Black Sea. Russia hit the Golden Leo, a Guinea-Bissau-flagged ship manned by a crew from India and Syria with 3 cruise missiles, causing a fire. Ukraine's Seaports Authority said the search and rescue operation lasted into the night, adding that 9 crew members and one of its maritime pilots were killed. 8 of the vessel's 17 crew members were rescued. A separate Russian attack on Ukraine's largest seaport killed 3 people and wounded 3 others on Monday. The UK's latest Prime Minister has delivered his first speech outside 10 Downing Street. Andy Burnham, who is the country's 7th Prime Minister in a decade, has promised to break with the politics of the past to deliver a new economic model for a UK that he says is fed up with a revolving door of leaders.
I am acutely conscious that I am the 6th person in the last 10 years to walk up this street. The 7th Prime Minister since 2016.
Mr. Burnham did not use the lectern that PMs usually do in moments like these, choosing to speak from the heart instead of from notes, which has disappointed those who are slightly obsessed with the man dubbed Hot Podium Guy, 42-year-old Tobias Goff, who's become an accidental heartthrob after he's been filmed setting up the podium before all the major prime ministerial announcements, including all those resignations. Former Collingwood and West Coast coach Mick Malthouse has appeared in court, describing the night three men allegedly attempted to break into his home. The 72-year-old explained how he was almost asleep when he heard a noise. He went to investigate and found three men allegedly outside his door with a crowbar. Malthouse had grabbed an exercise bar, describing how he hit one of the men with it before he himself was hit with the crowbar. He then chased them to the basement where they were stuck as they couldn't get the door open. Malthouse says the men allegedly told him that they'd got the wrong house and that someone owed them money. He ordered them to stand in a corner while he opened the door to get them out. As they left, he claims one of the men lunged at him with a screwdriver which stabbed him in the chest. The defence lawyer accused Mr. Malthouse of trapping the men and depriving them of their liberty. Malthouse said he did hold the door for as long as he could as there was no way to control their movements. The hearing will resume today. In what is believed to be an Australian first, a 34-year-old woman has delivered 4 naturally conceived identical girls. Janita Namoana says she didn't plan to have any more children, falling pregnant again coming as a surprise. But the shock didn't stop there, with the quadruplets emerging from a 1 in 15 million pregnancy, splitting into 4 from a single fertilised egg. Mrs. Namoana has now gone from being a mum of 4 to a mum of 8 overnight after delivering her girls by C-section at just over 28 weeks at the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. To finish off today, One Nation MP Barnaby Joyce has lost it at his dog during an interview with the ABC 7:30 report. During the live interview, while being questioned over his party leader's appearance on Right-Wing Identity, Tommy Robinson's podcast, and whether it was pulling him in a direction he wasn't comfortable with, his dog apparently wandered towards him, with Mr. Joyce responding in a very firm manner.
Joyce, that your decision to defect to One Nation is dragging you further into a place of intolerance and racial discrimination. You're defending your leader, but are you really comfortable with where she is taking you?
I think... Sit down! Sorry, it's a dog.
He apologised again for the dog later in the interview, to which presenter Sarah Ferguson asked him to stop worrying about the dog and answer the question, to which he told her to stop being rude or he'd end the interview. At the end of the chat, she told him the dog was no problem, to which he said, "It was to me." That's your top stories for Tuesday. Next, what's down with house prices and just how low can we go? You're probably well aware of this bit of data, but Australia is one of the least affordable places in the world to buy a home. When the Howard government introduced the 50% capital gains tax discount in 1999, when the national average to buy a property was just over $200,000, I know, that hurts to hear when you're not one who's yet cracked the market. According to ABS stats, though, the majority of the 7.2 million households back then owned their home. Most of those households, in 1999, spent 25% or less of their income on housing costs. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, Australians with a new mortgage today are paying 40 to 50% of their income on repayments. Now, what keeps most of those homeowners going is the knowledge that eventually that asset will increase in value and be there for them if they need to sell and take the money they've earned from simply buying a property. Either that, or they could leverage the equity to buy more homes and create a portfolio that was almost guaranteed to increase in value. But with interest rates rising in the face of increasing inflation, unrest in areas of the globe impacting cost of living, and now the government introducing changes to the capital gains and negative gearing rules, things are changing. After years of strong growth, Australian house prices are falling. It's mostly impacting Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra, but it is also starting to creep into those regional areas, especially those that saw a lot of city folk influx during COVID, those coastal towns that flourished when working from home was becoming the norm, a trend that is also reversing in 2026. So what does that mean when house prices fall? Nerida Conisbee is the Chief Economist for the Ray White Group. Nerida, welcome back to the Solo Bureau.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with a little overseas comparison. I was having a look at what it looks like for a country to have house prices that are not like here in Australia, where we are one of the most expensive countries in the world to purchase property, and what that looks like when it's opposite. And it seems like Japan is experiencing that with their declining population levels. Property isn't as valuable as what it used to be. And in fact, there is a lot of TikTok videos now of people who are investing in Japanese property and basically going and buying abandoned houses with everything in it. And it costs them like $100,000, which seems minuscule in American dollars, I'm talking about. So what does it look like in a country where that is happening?
I mean, Japan is a fascinating case study because, as you said, we do have places where people abandon homes, they throw in the keys and they walk away. And the reason being is that perhaps they can't pay the rates, they can't maintain them. And as a result, they do, leads to these incredibly cheap prices. The thing with Japan, though, you do have to look more broadly at that market, because if you go to a place like Tokyo, it's certainly not cheap. And even though Japan has seen a declining population, it has impacted primarily the regions where there's not many jobs and there's not much opportunity. And it has meant that a lot of people have gone into big cities like Tokyo, and that's really kept the pricing of property in that area. New Zealand is another really interesting example. New Zealand was very, very similar to Australia in that it was incredibly expensive. And now we've had 5 years where prices haven't moved, and it's moved from a market where we've got an undersupply of property to an oversupply of property. But really what's driven that is we have seen quite high levels of migration out of New Zealand. So that has clearly led to less pressure on housing demand, and obviously that leads to less pressure on house prices. And then we've got places like Singapore. I mean, it's a really broad subject, but Singapore, again, it has got very expensive housing, but has got quite affordable housing, particularly for first home buyers. And that is really driven a lot by the fact that the Singaporean government does own all the land in Singapore, so they have much more control over how that land is split up. And then they've got some pretty strict rules as well around ownership, first home buyers owning property, and then what happens to them once they start to earn a lot more money. So there's different ways that countries handle affordability, but clearly what we can see is that when there is a lot more property than people, that's when we do get very high levels of affordability.
Okay, so as I mentioned, Australia is one of the most expensive places in the world to buy property. But in your economic opinion, are Australian house prices currently too high? Where should they be when you do compare us to other similar countries' housing markets?
Yeah, look, they are too high. I mean, we do have big problems with affordability. I think, I don't know exactly where they should be. I mean, if you have a look at places in Australia that have become more affordable, Melbourne is a very good example. And the main reason Melbourne has become far more affordable than Sydney and even smaller cities like Brisbane and Perth is that we have seen enormous levels of construction taking place. And again, very similar to what's happening in places where we've got far more housing supply than population growth. It does lead to a calming of prices and much higher levels of affordability. So I don't know if there's a good answer to that in terms of what a good median price is for a city, but I think the answer is that there has to be a mix, and there has to be a mix of extremely affordable property for people who may be on social welfare or, may have extremely low incomes. There has to be available shelter for them. And then, of course, there's always going to be much more expensive properties for people that can afford them. So I think it is difficult to try and work out exactly what an affordable median should be. But as you said, there's no doubt when we have a look at the median relative to incomes, Australia is an extremely expensive place to buy.
Okay, so we have found ourselves now in the middle of kind of like the perfect storm for house prices to come down. So we've got interest rates that have gone up recently. We have got an economic crisis going on with fuel prices going up, for example, and sort of unrest in the Gulf area between the US and Iran. We've also had the government change the way that capital gains and negative gearing works. So all of these things are combining, and now house prices are starting to come down. Can you give us an idea of exactly what that looks like. And I understand probably the big cities are the first place we see that start to happen.
Yeah, so house prices were starting to come down at the top end of the market since the start of the year. So we were seeing the premium suburbs of Sydney, in particular, Melbourne as well. They were already starting to come back once interest rates started to rise, once the Middle East conflict started up, once consumer sentiment fell. All of those things started to lead to a fall, and that's why when you have a look at any lists which look at the past 12 months and say, oh, well, these are the suburbs falling the most, they do tend to be the top end of the market. So they weren't impacted at that point by the budget. They were just impacted primarily by what was happening with access to finance and also with sentiment. The more affordable end of the market was really being propped up by the 5% deposit scheme. So what we were seeing across every capital city was that when you had a look at property prices under the cap for that 5% first home buyer scheme, those properties were accelerating at a much faster rate than the rest of the market. And the gap was quite extreme. And if you have a look in somewhere like Sydney, for example, they're running at about 3% higher than the median. And so, clearly we could see that what the government had done at that point is that they'd stimulated the demand side. So they'd stimulated first home buyer demand, but they hadn't matched it with housing supply. So as a result, prices started to move very quickly. The budget focused very much on investors, so that the key aim of the budget was to get investors out of the market and make it easier for first home buyers. And so what we expect now is that cheaper end of the market, which was accelerating quickly because of the 5% deposit scheme, will now start to see much more moderate growth, because investors do primarily buy in similar price points to first home buyers, and with their withdrawal, we should start to see lower price growth. I think what we will see is that prices will continue to fall for a bit longer. I think at least for the next sort of 3 to 4 months. I think we'll start to see a switch in the balance. So whereas before the budget, the more affordable end of the market was moving more quickly than the more expensive end, I think we'll start to now see a switch where the more affordable end is moving a lot slower because investors have pulled back, and comparatively the top end of the market will move a little bit quicker. The switch at which we will start to see price growth again, I think will be once interest rates are cut. So at this point, we don't quite know when that will be. There's talk even of, potentially one more increase. But the reality is it probably isn't until next year. And so that's probably the point at which things will start to move forward. Probably one other point to note is that although prices will fall, there's one thing that really stops them falling at a huge rate, and that is the cost of construction. And replacement cost for a home now is far more expensive than homes are selling for, and we can certainly see that on the urban fringe in many new development areas, that building a brand new home is a lot more expensive than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And so that will be the floor at which, in terms of how far prices can fall. And that's why I think, even a 10% fall across the board seems unlikely, because construction costs are re-accelerating and are expected to increase, 10, 20% over the next 3 to 4 years.
I was reading a story this morning, actually, that said that even if Australian house prices drop by 10% on average, that only puts us back to 2024. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's right. So I think this is, again, the challenge is that, we really want affordable property. It's not easy, and it's not as easy as changing tax policy. It really involves building a lot more homes. The other challenge too is that we are an extremely low density country, and if you have a look at the rest of the world, they do live more so in smaller homes. They live in townhouse homes, they live in apartments. And so the fact is we live in very big homes. We like a lot of spare bedrooms. We like a lot of space. And then when you have a look at the status of the family home, it is a tax-free asset. And so when people hit retirement, there's no real incentive to downsize into something smaller or cheaper because there's tax disadvantages to do so. So I think that's the other problem, that we do like our space, and we are quite unique in having so many spare bedrooms and so much space in our homes, which is, again, extremely hard to change when we all like it so much.
Can I ask you about some of the predictions that I've seen in the last 24 to 48 hours? So I saw a prediction that we're entering into a year-long slump as far as real estate goes. Morgan Stanley predicted a 10% decline, which we've already spoken about. Bank of America warned that Sydney and Melbourne could drop 8% this year alone. It feels very alarmist. Should we be alarmed by these predictions?
Look, I think every downturn we get similar forecasts coming out, and the reality is that the worst downturn we've had in the last 40 years has been 7% during the global financial crisis. I think that the predictions are becoming a little bit more realistic now. I think, the last few downturns we've had, there was predictions of 30% price falls, and, clearly people are a little bit more knowledgeable about what happens to pricing and the complexities of house prices now. So I think, they are less alarmist now than they used to be. I think, though, too, in cities like Melbourne and cities like Sydney, we can clearly see that they are in downturn now, and they're also building a lot of homes. So, I think too, when we compare Sydney and Melbourne to the amount of housing being built to cities like Brisbane and Perth, it's at a much greater rate, and so that's also contributing to much higher levels of affordability. If you go to cities like Perth and you go to Brisbane, they are having a lot of difficulties in getting homes built. There's not enough trades. There's competing demands for trades. You've got mining in WA, in Queensland. You've got a lot of infrastructure being built. You've got the Olympics. And as a result, it's just really hard to get housing out of the ground. So I think Sydney and Melbourne, they do seem to be the two cities that we will see price declines. I don't think it'll be as high as 8%. I think, if we hit 5%, I think that will be a pretty large decline. But I think in other cities it may or may not have price declines on a year-on-year basis. But, I do think over the coming months we will start to see monthly declines, which will, be as a result of what's happening across the board.
Just finally, Nerida, what does it mean for those people who had to borrow a lot of money to buy their home when house prices fall? If they don't do anything, if they're just there paying their mortgage, does it make a difference?
Look, it shouldn't. I think the problem is if you've bought recently and that the value of your home falls, I think, it is quite alarming. And I think a lot of people have done it in the past. I mean, I certainly know that any time I've bought homes is over the next few months, I always felt that I'd paid too much and that I was, buying at the wrong time. But the reality is it only becomes a problem if you do want to sell right now. And I think if you're holding on and you're paying off your mortgage, the trick is just to, keep doing that. Don't focus too much on the news. Don't panic. And, I think that's the best way forward.
Thanks for taking some time out of your day to hang with the Solo Bureau today, folks. Tassie parents are the only ones left with kiddos at home for the winter break. Now, I hear so many parents saying, thank goodness the children are back with their teachers. I'm actually the complete opposite. I think it's because maybe I loathe making school lunches and having to drop off and pick up. Essentially, I think what I'm realising in this moment is I'm quite a lazy parent. So Tassie mums, dads and carers, enjoy this last week of not having to do any of that. The rest of us, in fact the entire rest of the mainland, is back either today or tomorrow. Can't wait to ask my kid 400 times to empty her lunchbox and to go find her school jumper. Anyway, venting time is over. Have a great day. If you're feeling the vibes, feel free to drop a comment in your favourite podcast app about today's episode or any other episode for that matter. You are single-handedly helping me beat back the algorithm. Like an actual army of keyboard warriors, the good kind, not the other ones. Catch you tomorrow.